Well, hello and welcome to today's webinar. This is Peter Frank, and I'll be leading our 3-session training series on Church360 Ledger. We'll be getting started in just a moment, but I wanted to first thank you for being here today. It is my pleasure to show you Church360 Ledger because this is the one product that I've really been able to see from the very beginning all the way through where it is today. We've got Church360, our suite of products, and most of those, or the first two, Members and Unite, were well underway before I became involved. But my very first day, I got to see exactly what the basics of Church360 Ledger were, and so I'll talk about that as we go. All right, well, again, my name is Peter Frank. I am the Senior Manager of Marketing Technology at Concordia Publishing House, leading our Concordia Technology Solutions team on both product development and marketing. So I have my hands in a lot of different things. I'm also involved on the website side of things with our cph.org e-commerce site and all of our different analytics and reporting. So I really get into the numbers, I get into spreadsheets. Finance is a little bit different than that, but I've been able to get a good understanding of how it works through both my experience with the product development, my experience with customers, and then also my experience at my own church. We use Church360 Ledger, and I've been able to introduce the software and train a number of people on it. So you'll be getting the benefit of all of that today. I am by no means an expert at any of those things, but I'm well versed in all of them. So if you have questions, please go ahead and reach out to me. My email address is there. We'll also be sharing the support team information later on. They are excellent to work with and can help you in addition to me. In case you're not familiar with us, Concordia Technology Solutions is the church administration division of Concordia Publishing House, and we've been developing software since 1984. That's always a little mind-boggling to me because I remember when I got my first computer around 1994, or our family got our computer. I wasn't even alive back in 1984. And so to just know that we have brought that wealth of experience and have passed it down to each person that has come in and worked for CTS, you can be assured that we've got that experience supporting you along the way. Now, Concordia Publishing House has been here even longer. In fact, our time developing software is just a blip on our timeline. We've been here since 1869, over 150 years, developing products for the church, serving as the publishing arm of the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod. There's just a portion of our team there from our kickoff of our 150th anniversary celebration right back in 2018. We celebrated it with another big celebration last year, 2019. Church360 Ledger, if you're not familiar, maybe somebody just said, hey, take this webinar, you're gonna need to know this information. Church360 Ledger is a web-based finance software designed exclusively for churches. It streamlines the accounting process so that balancing budgets and managing accounts is simple and intuitive. We use a cash basis accounting method, which I'll talk about a little bit today. And we do a number of different things in here that are just tailored for churches. One of the things we do is we exclude things churches don't need. If you have another software package, often you are paying for features that you will never touch as a church, and you'll have to sift through them in the interface as you go. But as a church, you should be able to use all aspects of the software. This is a 3-session training. The first one today is cash basis accounting basics and account setup. So we're really going to lay the groundwork for everything else the rest of the week. Tomorrow we'll be getting into transactions and other daily tasks, the things that you will do most often in Church360 Ledger. And then on Wednesday we'll shift gears to things that are more like month-end processes, reconciliation and reports. So this is the first time we've ever divided it up in exactly this way. I think this will work out well. It kind of helps narrow our focus on a day-to-day basis, and sometimes, depending on how large your church is, you'll be the one doing all of these things, or you might have a different person involved in each one. So that's why we divided it up that way. A few housekeeping items before we get started. I am planning 75 minutes for presentation. I tend to go over that, so I apologize in advance if I do. The thing that I'll cut into is our question and answer time. But if we have more questions than we have time, I'll be happy to stay on the line and answer those for you. Now, one of our most common questions is, are you recording this webinar? Well, the answer to that is yes. Yes, we are. I'll be sharing that recording tomorrow morning. You'll get an email from me with a link to our resource center where you can watch the recording after the fact. If you want to share it with somebody else in your congregation, that is completely fine. These will be publicly available in our resource center. Now, attendees are all muted. We have a number of people who have joined us today. Unfortunately, because of that large number, we can't have everybody with their mics on. So you will be asked to participate, but not verbally. In fact, I'll be asking you to participate in just a few moments. But if you do want to ask questions, I encourage you to ask questions through our questions section in the GoToWebinar panel. Our software support technician, Jordan, will be answering those questions as I go. And then at the very end during our Q&A time, I'll review those questions and share the answers that I think are appropriate for everybody and answer any that Jordan was not able to get to. Well, let's go ahead and talk about some assumptions. I always make some assumptions about the people who are attending the webinar. It helps me get into the right frame of mind, present the material for the right audience. They're not always accurate, but I want you to know what my thought was before you see this so that you know where I'm coming from. So the first assumption is that you're a brand new user to Church360 Ledger. Now, I know many of you have been using this for a while, and I'm going to ask that question in a moment about what your skill level is. But we're going to start at the very, very basics and work our way up. So there will be advanced techniques along the way, but I'm not going to skip over anything that's important. So we're going to start from this assumption that you are a new user. I'm also assuming you have full access to all features, that role of administrator. Now, it's very likely that you don't, that you're limited in what you can do because of what your role at the church is. But I'm going to show everything. And so if you see something on the screen that you don't have access to, that's because you probably have a different role. That's all right. You probably only need access to what you can see, but I am going to show everything. And so that's the thing I want to caution you on. If you see something that you can't see in your computer, it's probably because of your role. I'm also assuming that you're not an accountant. I'm not an accountant either. I'm assuming that you are somebody who has some experience with finance, but has not worked as a full-time accountant. Now, if you are, wonderful. That is a blessing to your church, but I know not every church has that. And so we are going off the assumption today that you are not an accountant. But this gives you a chance to tell me a little bit about yourself now. And maybe I'm completely off on my assumptions, but at least that's where the material is coming from. So I'm going to go ahead and share a poll question. The first one is about your role at the church. Now, we've had some people who've had issues clicking on these before. So if you can't actually answer this, it's not the end of the world. It's not going to affect your status within the training course. This is purely informational for me. And I'm curious as to what type of roles we have attending this. And again, this is roles within the church, not within the software. We'll give this another minute or so. And like I expected, the majority of the people so far are in that financial manager role, which is just fine. That's exactly what I was hoping. Again, it doesn't mean that you're an accountant. It just means that you are in that role within the church. All right, so I'm going to close this and share it with everybody. Let's see here. There we go. Hopefully you're seeing that. So we're at about 63% financial manager, 25% other, and 13% administrator. Now I ask a very similar question. So number one in all my other webinars. So number one on the list is ordained pastor. We don't have any of those today, but it is amazing how many pastors are asked to manage their church finances. All right. The next question I have for you is related to Church360 Ledger and whether you're already using it. Launch that poll. So are you using Church360 right now? There's three options: yes, no, or no, but planning to subscribe soon. This will help me find out whether or not you are actively using this or if you're just considering this. Now, for the most part, I'm assuming you are, and that's what the results are showing me today, that yes, you are using it. But if you're not and you're using this webinar to evaluate it, I appreciate you being here. All right, I'll give that another few seconds. It looks like we're at about 67% yes, 22% no, and 11% no, but planning too soon. So that means about 2/3 of you are, another third is not. Finally, for those of you who are, those 2/3 of you, what would you consider your skill level to be? This is more just out of my own curiosity. It's not really going to change the presentation at all unless you all say you're experts, which I highly doubt. Never had that happen before. Yeah, just as I expected, the majority of you are in those lower two. About 20% are on intermediate. Now as we're going through it, it's looking a little bit closer to thirds. I've got some who are advanced. Very good. All right, well, I'm going to go ahead and close that as well. So we've got everything except expert. So we're about a third, a little less than a third each for intermediate, novice, and newbie. Well, let's go ahead and continue on. Let's give a quick overview of Church360. If you're not familiar with the Church360 suite, it is 3 different products that help you have complete church management. So today we're talking about Church360 Ledger, of course, and I'll explain that in much more detail in a moment. But the other 2 software options are Church360 Members, which is our member management, allows you to manage your contact information for your members, track their different attributes, group them together so that you can have appropriate lists when you go to communicate. It also allows you to track attendance, and there is a financial side to it too. This is where you track offerings. So that's one of the common questions I get is, where do you track offerings in Church360 Ledger? Well, I mean, to be completely blunt, you don't. You track the deposits from the offerings, but the individual offerings and the contribution statements, that's all done in Members, because that's all about people and tracking their involvement as opposed to the chart of account side of things, which is Ledger. Now, the other product in our suite is Church360 Unite. That's our church website builder that lets you do far more than just build a website. It lets you build a whole online experience for your congregation. There's not really any connections between Ledger and Unite other than who we developed it for. The church is the primary audience for both of those. And so we have many churches that utilize all 3 of these, and there are integration points between Members in Ledger and Members in Unite. And it makes for a really great experience. We're continuing to look at how we can expand this suite and provide even more opportunities to grow. But today we're talking about Church360 Ledger. And again, it's church finance software. I'm going to talk about some of the goals in just a moment, but some key themes you'll hear throughout this is that it's designed to be intuitive, meaning it should lead you along the way. It's not going to do your thinking for you, but should not be so hard that you have to start from scratch each time. It's also meant to be secure, and I'll talk about what that means, both from preventing bad things from happening, but also preventing mistakes from happening. And finally, it is church focus. We understand that all of you are doing this out of service to the Lord, whether it's in a paid position or in a volunteer position. We know that you have that thought behind it, that this is your service to God and to Christ and his church. And that makes it something different than just being a finance software with credits and debits. What you're dealing with is the gifts that have been given to the church, the tithes and offerings, and that makes a really big difference into how you see your work. And so we keep that in mind as well. In fact, the majority of the software developers that are on this team are ordained ministers. They have worked in the church before, they had experience in programming before, and now they take both of those to build software for use in the church. So you can have that understanding or assurance that our team is right there alongside with you, thinking about how this is service to Christ and his church. All right, so what are those goals? When we set off developing Church360 Ledger, we had some key things we kept in mind. Well, first off, we wanted to make finances simple enough for volunteers. Many churches rely on volunteers for managing their finances. Many churches don't have a paid staff person who is capable of managing finances, and they don't have the finances to hire somebody to do that. And so they rely on volunteers. So we looked at that first and foremost throughout all of our development. Next, we understand that there are some volunteers who are professionals. You are looking for high quality church finance software. And so we wanted to make sure that we met that need as well. And so we'll talk about that, where we reveal things like credits and debits that you don't necessarily need to know if you are a volunteer, but you do want to know if you're an accountant. All right, we wanted to prevent the ill intention from doing wrong. You've probably heard the news stories before where there's a volunteer or a paid staff person who embezzles from the church. Well, certainly that is not something that we want to allow. We can't always prevent it, but that is something that we try to do by making it very clear what happens. So if you are looking at this nefariously, you'll see that it's very hard to come about changing the transactions in a way that is hiding what actually happened. And even if you do change the transaction, there's that trail. We'll talk about that a number of different times. Finally, oh, actually not finally, one more after this. We also want to prevent the well-intentioned from making mistakes. We understand that the majority of the mistakes are made by people who are really trying their best and trying to do what they can to serve the church. Now, occasionally there's some careless mistakes that happen too, but that's again from people who are trying their best. And so we want to make it as difficult as possible to make a mistake. And I'll point out those areas in the software as we go. Lastly, we want to give access where and how you need it. For one, this is web-based church management software or church finance software. So you can access this from home. You don't have to be at the church office. You don't have to be using your church computer. You can access it remotely from your home personal computer. It also only gives you the access that you need. We're going to talk about that today with users and roles so that you can set up access for the people of your congregation, give them exactly what they need and no more. So our training goal for today is pretty straightforward. By the end of the day, you'll know how to set up your Church360 Ledger account and establish a chart of accounts for your church. Like I said, pretty straightforward. Our outline is that we're going to talk about cash basis accounting basics. We'll spend a few minutes on that, not in great detail. I'm going to show it more than I'm going to describe it. We're going to go through books and fiscal years. That's kind of the basis. You won't think about this too often, which is why I want you to think about it now. We'll go through the chart of accounts and add different accounts. This is a key part of Church360 Ledger, and getting this right at the beginning is especially important. We're going to talk about restricted funds and why that is so important to get set up at the beginning and understand how to use those, because that is really what sets Church360 Ledger apart from any other standard finance software. It allows you to protect the funds that were given for specific purposes. We'll talk about budgets and how to enter those. I'll show you a few little tricks. We'll get into users near the very end. There's not a lot of complications here, so this will go fairly quickly, but I'll be curious about your questions. And then finally, we'll do a quick look at an import from Shepherd staff. Now, this won't apply to all of you, so I don't want to spend too much time at the beginning talking about it. So we'll swing back at the end to cover that topic. So if you are currently a Shepherd staff user, you're going to want to stick around to hear that part of it. If you're not already using Church360 Ledger, I encourage you to start your free trial at 360ledger.com. This will allow you to follow along and kind of help you see that screen as we go. It'll make much more sense if you can see it from your perspective and also from mine. Well, the first thing I want to talk about before I go too far is that cash basis accounting. What does it mean by cash basis? Well, it's pretty straightforward. It's like how you might manage your personal finances. Meaning we focus on the cash that is currently in the bank accounts for the church. Everything is sort of in real time, if you will. So cash basis recognizes income when it's received. So if you receive an offering from a member, or if you receive tuition from your church's school, well, you receive it at the time that you actually obtain it. That's the primary purpose. Now, there's some hybrid models that you can follow that may be more appropriate for your situation. And I encourage you to talk with somebody who is more knowledgeable in finances to make sure that it is right for your situation. You can do that within Church360 Ledger, but our focus is on receiving income when it's actually received, or recognizing income when it's received. And at the same time, we recognize expenses when they occur. So if you are paying out your payroll, you're going to recognize that expense when it is paid. You won't divide it up and have it split evenly throughout the year, just in, if maybe 1 month you have 3 pay periods, another you have 2, and so you kind of divide it up. No, we don't do any of that with cash basis. When the money leaves your bank account, you expense it at that time. And when you are paying any other sort of bill, you expense it at that time. And that's about it for cash basis that we're going to cover today. This is not going to be a finance lesson, but I want to make that clear, because you'll hear that from time to time where, well, we're going to recognize a portion of this now and a portion of it later, as that value is actually exchanged as opposed to when the transaction happens. And so I don't want to get too much into what we don't do, but that's the quick summary of what we don't do. Well, let's go ahead and log into the software. And I'm actually going to start outside of the software. You see, the first thing I'm going to do is show you what it looks like to set up your account. So when you go to Church360Ledger.com, you're going to see this screen, and you would start a free trial. Now, if you're already using the software, then you're past this part. You can go grab a cup of coffee or something real quickly. You can see here, here's the form that you fill out. I've already filled out this form and then received an email. And you'll see this is, oops, that's the wrong one. We're going to use that later on today. This is the one that I want. And I can tell because it gives me the link. And so I'm going to set up my Church360 Ledger training account by clicking on this Set Up Your Account Now button. And then what I'm also going to do is close my email so that I don't have that popping up while talking. All right, so the first thing I'm going to do is set up my account itself. So I'm going to type in my email address, and then I'm going to type in my password. I hope I get it right the first time. There we go, confirmed. It is working. I'm also going to zoom in a little bit so you can see better. You can zoom in on your own computer. It's a function of your browser. Typically, most browsers will let you zoom in if you hit Control and scroll on your mouse or Control and plus on your keyboard. Well, let's see why this is taking so long. Normally it doesn't take that long, but of course, since I'm presenting live, it might be because I have that video going. So we'll give it another minute or so. Let me close out of this. I also sent that welcome token quite a while ago, so that could be part of that. We'll do a quick refresh. Try it again. I gotta actually type my password right. Oh, it did set it up. I just wasn't patient enough. So we'll go ahead and set it up under a different email address. There we go. All right, so next I will enter in my church details, which I did at the time, so it's just confirming those. I'll go ahead and click submit. Now I will warn you, this is a fictional church. None of the information that I'm using today is real. Now it's based off my experiences with my church and other customers, so some of it might sound somewhat familiar, but it's not going to be real information that's shared. So during the setup process, there are 2 paths, and within the second path, there are 2 options. So the first path, and the one that we're going to take right now, is to just create a book from scratch. Now, what is a book? Well, as it defines it right here, it's a unique collection of accounts and transactions. Think about your situation and how many books you might need. Another way I describe it is your chart of accounts. Do you have multiple charts of accounts that you're managing? Well, then you might need multiple books. Think about a church and school situation. Does your church manage their finances separately from the school, or is it all done together? You might have some different organizations within your church that have their own finances that you never touch. Well, that would be a different book. So there's no right or wrong answer to how many books you have. It's going to be based on your unique situation. But you want to name it accurately. And so in this case, we're going to name it church, or I could actually put the full name, Christ Community Church. That doesn't really matter because you're the only one that sees this. It doesn't print out on anything. It's just for managing your finances on this side of things, not on the public facing side. The next thing you do is you select your starting month in your fiscal year. Now, many churches will go a calendar year, January to December fiscal year. but churches that have schools often do it the school year. So like July through June, or maybe August through July. So pick that first month that is appropriate. I'm going to start with July just because that's what I'm used to and I think is appropriate as we're coming up on the summer. Now, the next one is enter the start date of the book. This is the date as of which all your initial balances will be set. You won't be able to create transactions prior to this date, but you may change it later. Well, we are recording this video on May 18th. So I'm going to go ahead and set it for May 1st. You can switch over your finances to Church360 Ledger at any time, but I recommend at least doing it on a month end, and if you can get it to the fiscal year end, that works sometimes better. So those are the few pieces of information that I need to start. But on the right-hand side, you'll see it says import your Shepherd Staff Finance database. If you're currently using Shepherd Staff, you can bring in your database. There's one caveat to it. If you are using dedicated accounts, which is a type of account in Shepherd Staff that we don't have in Church360 Ledger, if you're using those accounts, you won't be able to bring over all your transactions. You'll be able to bring over your balances as of today and the rest of your chart of accounts, but you won't be able to bring over all of those individual details. And that's the example I'm going to show you in a little while at the very end of our presentation. Now, you could choose to start by and attempt it. Maybe you don't know how it's set up. It'll let you know if you can't. And then you'd switch to this other option, import chart of accounts with current balances only. So you'll be able to bring in information one way or the other, but not necessarily all of it. So I'm going to go ahead and click submit on the left-hand side because I'm starting from scratch with this account. So the book was created and it's going to take me to my chart of accounts screen. Well, I'm not going to start here yet. I want to give you an example or a quick explanation of the navigation, the user interface, how all of this works. Now, again, I'm going to zoom in a little bit so you can see because I know your screen is probably smaller than what I'm seeing here. In the very top left, you'll see that orange icon with the $sign. That is our Church360 Ledger logo. You can click that at any time to get back to the home screen. This is what the home screen looks like. Next to that, to the right, you have where it says Christ Community Church with a little arrow next to it. When you click on that arrow, it shows you a listing of all your books. Now, we just created one book, so I only have that one option. But if you have multiple books, and I'll show you that in a moment, if you have multiple books, you'll be able to navigate between the different books just by clicking right there. To the far right, you'll see a number of different icons. The first icon looks like a printer. This is your print queue for printing out checks. If you have pre-printed checks and you just print the details on it out of your normal printer, this is where you would go to do that. Now, if you handwrite all your checks, you'll never touch this area, or maybe very little. But if you don't use checks, if you do everything digitally, well, then you don't have to worry about it. You can just ignore it. But I'm guessing there's still some times when you have to mail a check. To the right of that is pending transactions. These are potential transactions, meaning you can use the information that's shared there or you can dismiss it. We'll get into that tomorrow. Next up is reports. You'll see a number of different reports, including the event log. We're going to cover this in detail on Wednesday, session 3. To the right of that is our settings cog. There's a number of different things here that we're going to get into today. To the right of that is your user. Your user settings and your logout are right in this dropdown. Now, because there's so little here, I'm going to look at user settings right now to show you this is where you go to change your password. You have to enter in your current password and a new password twice if you're going to change it. It's also where you can update your email address if you want to change how you log in. Those are everything that's in that top navigation, but then next to that is a big, or below that I should say, is a big white bar. This is what we call your Omni bar. This actually gives you quick access to every one of your chart of accounts. You'll see as we build that chart of accounts that it's very much a tree of information, meaning there is indentation to show there's sub-accounts, and you can have various levels of that hierarchy, all of which will show up here. It'll make more sense when we get into it, so I'm not going to spend too much time on it right now. But I'm going to click this home page button because I want to show a few more things. To the right of your Omni bar is your new transaction button, and there's several different transaction paths. So we'll cover that in detail tomorrow, but this will show up on pretty much every account view. The account view is what is below this. Excuse me a second. I'm on week 5 of presenting long webinars, and my voice is slowly fading. Usually on day 1, it's not this bad, so I apologize in advance. Underneath here is your account view, and this account view has a few different charts. Now, there's not data in here right now, so it doesn't look very exciting, but I'll get data in and it'll look better. You'll have the ability to see where you are at. This is kind of a breadcrumb, if you will. So right now it says home, but if I clicked on assets, I would see that next step there. Now I can actually click on this identifier to close what we call the mini graphs. These 4 icons here, these 4 boxes, can be dismissed easily just by clicking on that. To the far right, we have an export to Excel. Any screen that you see that can go directly to Excel where you can manage it or copy and paste or format it for printing. Speaking of printing, we have a print button here too. Print will use your browser print, and it's not a fantastic experience if you ask me. I prefer to send everything to Excel, but I'm also an Excel junkie, and so that's my personal preference. To the far right of that is your date selector, and your date selector stays with you, or at least the dates you select stay with you throughout your session until you change it. Meaning as you log in, you'll see these dates every time. We give you some quick links. So the first one is just your entire fiscal year, 2020 to 2021. Then you have your different quarters. Now these quarters are the quarters of your fiscal year. So as we are in May and our fiscal year ends at the end of June, you'll note that we're in quarter 4. When I click on quarter 4, actually it's not giving me the right date. Maybe I didn't set up the right month. Huh. Well, that's okay. We'll take a look at that in just a few moments. Then below that is months. You can see here, we can select it and it'll give you the month of this current year. You can also just type in a custom date range. So you can pick a starting and ending date, and everything that you do will be filtered by those dates. So we created our chart, or our books. We're going to get to our chart of accounts in a minute, but I want to show you where you can go if you want to add more books. So under the setting cog, you'll notice there's a divider line. The things above the divider line are meant for this book, and the things below that are meant for what we call your tenant or your overall account. Now the word account is used in finances, and so it gets a little confusing. But what I mean is your Church360 Ledger account. This is all what can be accessed by one link. So like today I'm using training.360ledger.com. This is what applies to that entire account. So you have your general settings, which are pretty straightforward. You can put in your church name here, exactly how it'll print out. Oops, there it goes. I was just slow on filling it. Christ Community Church. Your customer number is there, your check style. We'll talk about that tomorrow. And whether or not you use 2 signatures. And then your church address and phone number. There's not too much there, and most of it's pre-populated for you. Users will be covered later on, along with roles. Next, you have books. This is what I mentioned before. Now we created one book. If we wanted to add a new one for maybe Christ Community School, you can do that as well. You can also set your starting fiscal year and your first date, or first date of transactions. So now that I've created that, I can go in here. Whoops, I have to refresh for my book to show. There, now it shows that option up there. Now you can see if I click on here, I can change the starting date of my book activity, or at least until I reconcile. But what I want to do is go to fiscal years. Now remember, I'm up in the top half, so that's related to just this book. So when I click on fiscal years, you'll see that it says May 2020 to April 21. I meant to start it at July. So if I go in here and I say start my fiscal year in July, change the starting month of the next fiscal year to July, I click that and save, my new fiscal year has started. Now let me go ahead and refresh my screen. Oops, it should have saved, but maybe just because I haven't actually done anything yet, it's not showing that. Again, this is one of those things that you don't think about too often unless you're changing your fiscal year, which probably doesn't happen frequently at your church. That's okay. It's now set to that. We'll take a look at that later on as we get into budgeting. I'm going to go to my chart of accounts next. You'll notice that I have several other things that are related to transactions here, but I'm going to chart of accounts, the very first option. This chart of accounts is basically the summary of all of your different transactions that you'll put in place, your reports. It's critical to get this right. And it can also be a little bit confusing if you're not an accountant. So let me walk you through these different types of accounts. So there are 4 types of accounts that you can set up. The first one are assets. Now, we all know the term assets from a variety of different definitions, but in this case, we're talking about actual cash assets. We're not talking about physical assets or estimated assets. Remember, this is cash basis accounting. And so everything has to do with actual cash. So you wouldn't put the value of your building, you wouldn't put the church van on here. It's just the cash that you have in bank accounts. So if you have a checking account or a savings account, or maybe you have a CD or an investment account where there's actual cash value, that's what you would put here. Now, this doesn't mean that it's liquid cash, meaning that it's cash available to you today. So if you do have some investments that the church has entered into, you can put those there and update them as you gain or lose dollars. So that's what you should think about first when you're setting up your chart of accounts, is where is our cash located? Now, it's, certainly your bank accounts are probably the place you'll have most of your cash, but you might also have some petty cash in the church office for minor expenses. Think about those kind of things. The next type of account is liability account. Now, liability is an account where you actually owe cash to a person or an organization, or it's some sort of debt that you took out, which I guess again is cash that you owe a person or organization. So if you took out a loan to pay for a building project, and maybe you took out the loan from a bank, you would create that and work it down. If you pay for something on account, like we offer that here at Concordia Publishing House, where you can be invoiced and pay 30 days later. That type of account is also a liability because it's money that you owe. The money hasn't left your bank account yet. The expense may have hit, but you still owe that cash. And so that's where a liability account comes into. Those are the different types of cash accounts where you can go and look at a balance somewhere. Now, the other types of accounts we have are income and expense. So income is the way you track money coming into your church during a given fiscal year. Unlike assets and liabilities, income and also expense accounts are cleared out at the end of the year. They zero out. So that income is that money that you have received, the actual cash that you've received on that fiscal year, during that fiscal year. Then on the flip side, expenses are money that you've spent during that fiscal year. So anything that goes out is considered an expense. Anything that comes in is considered an income. That might be oversimplifying it, but it accounts for most cases. So we're going to set up each of these type of accounts. I'm not going to complete an entire chart of accounts because that'll take way too long as we go through it, and you probably will get bored. So I'm not going to do that. I'm going to jump back into the software and show you how we set this up. Now, we talked about those being accounts. There's another thing called categories that I want to clarify before we go too far. So an account should mirror real life, at least in terms of assets and liabilities. So if you have a checking account or a savings account, each one of those would be a separate account. But you might have them both at the same bank. And for organizational sake, you want to structure them in that way so that you can always see, what do I have invested in that bank versus another bank? So we're going to start with categories. I'm going to click New Category, and all I have to enter is a name. And so maybe we call this American Bank. You can see I use that example quite a bit. I don't want to use an official bank name and start getting confusing, but there's probably an American bank out there. So I may not have succeeded in that goal, but I'm going to create one that's called American Bank. Now, the difference between a category and an account is that a category can maintain a balance, but you can't process transactions from the category. You can only process transactions at an account level. So you have to have an account within a category for it to be useful at all. So let's go ahead and create a couple accounts. The first account that I'm going to create is a savings account. The savings account, where you will store money to protect it for a time. Now, next to the savings account, you can enter an account number. There's a lot of different strategies available to you for how you number an account. But let me just say that it is purely optional. And if you don't want to use account numbers, you don't have to. Your names on the accounts could actually be just enough that you don't need to have an account number. Or you could have an account numbering system that you've used for years and everybody knows it. And it's easier to have that account number than to look up the name. That goes to the preferences of your church. I'm not going to tell you one is right and one is wrong. There's value in both. So that's your call, but I am going to come up with an account numbering system just for the sake of showing them on the screen. So a savings account will go 1-10001. Now, can you write checks from a savings account? Well, you could. Then it's more of a checking account unless you're earning income. But I'm going to leave this off so it doesn't allow you to write checks. And then I have the initial balance. Let's talk about that for just a quick second. So the initial balance should be the balance of cash in that account at a specific point in time. And it should be the same point in time for all of your accounts so that you don't accidentally double dip. So this is where planning in advance becomes a really key thing. That's why I suggest planning at a month end or a year end so that you can be sure that your starting balances are always correct. Now, why is it so important? Well, your current balance will be the sum of your starting balance and any of the transactions that took place and added or subtracted dollars to that account. So you need to start at that same place for all of your accounts, and a good cutoff is at the month end or the fiscal year end. We also prevent you from changing this number after you start entering transactions. The reason for that is when you are doing your initial setup, you might not have all of the transactions visible to you that are showing in the current balance. Oh, excuse me. So you might actually need to change that. But after you get going and you are changing your account, as you are balancing your account, there is a nefarious way of stealing money from the church that is essentially changing your initial balance. So maybe you take $100 out of your bank account and you say, well, actually, this initial balance was always $100 less. So you hide that you took that. You don't have to enter that transaction there, but your balances will match. Now, I know none of you would do that, but somebody else may have that intention, that negative, that sinful intention of doing so. And so changing your beginning balance will cover their tracks. Well, that's why we don't allow it. So once you you reconcile your account for the first time, you can never change that beginning balance without creating a transaction. Kind of locks it in place and says this was right at one point in time. So if it's not right now, you're missing some changes to the account. So I'm going to go ahead and set this up at $250,000. And I'll click submit. Now let's create a checking account as well. So we'll type in checking account and we'll use the similar numbering system. And we will say that you can write checks from this account. And this one is actually $25,000, a tenth of the other one. When I create these, you'll notice that both of their beginning balances show up correctly. Now we have them both under American Bank, but we have not actually moved them under in Church360 Ledger. That's because it is a hierarchical structure. And when you create new accounts, they are outside any sort of hierarchy, but you can quickly add them. So savings account is right below American Bank, but if we move it, drag and drop it and increase the indent, you'll see that little red arrow showing where the indent is. It is now under American Bank, and you'll notice that American Bank's balance now matches savings account balance because it is a sub-account of American Bank. We'll do the same thing with checking account, move it right underneath, and now my American Bank balance has increased by the amount of the checking account. I hope that makes sense why that's happening. It's essentially summarizing everything underneath it. Now, like I mentioned before, you can add as many different structures or levels to your hierarchy as you need. I know there is a cap, but it's a ridiculously high number that nobody has met yet. So I'm not even gonna attempt it. But you can use this strategically to get some of those balances of multiple accounts. So maybe you have multiple banks that you use. Well, you could create a new category called banks. Move that up to the top and move American Bank under that. Savings and checking are still under that as well. Now, that may not be necessary for you, but it's an option. And then you could create another category that is called investments. And we can add an account here that says CD at First Bank. And we'll do this under a different numbering system, or a similar numbering system, but different. And let's say there is 75,000 in that. So we'll move it over. So you can see, even though these are all accounts, there are different levels within the tree. Well, one thing I recommend is clicking save early and often, kind of like voting in Chicago. When we save that, now this is locked in place. Now, I haven't received a total for all of my assets on this page, but you can get that elsewhere, and I'll show you that in a few minutes. That's because it's only showing totals for categories or accounts. Now, there's another type of account that is very important, and we're going to talk about this throughout this course, but that is the restricted fund. You see, when you receive dollars for specific purposes, it is your obligation to set aside those dollars for those purposes. Now, where you set those dollars aside is up to you, but the important thing is that you do not use those dollars. And when I say you, I mean the church does not use those dollars for anything but the purpose for which they were set. So we've added this tool called a restricted fund, which essentially sets aside dollars that were restricted for a given purpose by putting them in a separate sub-account. So you have to be very intentional about spending money from that. Now, can you accidentally spend money from the bank account? Sure, but that is not something you would track in that same way on your chart of accounts. You would show that your unrestricted dollars, or the dollars not set aside for a specific purpose, would be used to pay that bill, not those that were set aside for said purpose. So let's give an example. I'll be here under, let's say, checking account. We'll say new restricted fund. Let's say somebody donates $100 to Vacation Bible School. So I'm going to create a new account that's called, oops, hang on, let me go here. I accidentally clicked off this checking account. New restricted fund, VBS. And the account number is 1-1-00012. One less zero. We'll hit save there. Now, can I write checks from that account? Whoops, I jumped ahead as well. Why do I keep doing that? New restricted fund, VBS, account number, and then submit. There we go. I keep clicking off of it. When I submit that, I not only get the VBS account, but I get an unrestricted checking account. Now you'll notice that it didn't ask me what I wanted the beginning balance to be. That's because you have to make that transaction to transfer it over. In other words, you start with the money that matches what your bank statement says, but then you set money aside based on how it was given. Now this is done in a number of different ways in other systems, so you probably already have that set aside to know just how much to put under VBS. Well, I'm going to go ahead and save this. And I'm going to go back to the home button because now I'm starting to get some numbers on my screen. You see there is assets. When I click on, well, you'll see first off, I have a summary of all assets, $350,000. When I click on assets, I go and see banks and investments. Now banks make up $275,000 while investments is only $75,000. When I click on banks, now I get to American Bank. That's my first category. When I click on American Bank, I get 2 banking accounts, savings and checking. These are actual bank accounts. When I click on checking, you'll notice that I have my unrestricted and my VBS accounts that are underneath it. So I've continually gone down the line. Now at this level, that bank account level, that account level using ledger terms, this is what you reconcile against your bank statement, because this is one account in the real world where your dollars are stored. Now you can access that during reconcile, but I'm going to get into that on Thursday, so I'm not going to show you too much today. Pardon me a second. Very good. So we now have a restricted fund set up with no dollars. What I'm going to do briefly is transfer some dollars to that. And I'm going to cover transactions in greater detail tomorrow. So I'm not actually going to describe what I'm doing, but I'm going to move $20,000 to our VBS account. That's a lot. Let's move 2,000. Let's see, we'll call this VBS restricted transfers. Transfer, singular. Now you'll notice that I've transferred $2,000 out of it. There's a balance here. Now there's no line items, but there is a balance here. And so this is a good reminder that $2,000 are available for VBS. Now we can use other funds for VBS, but we should use these funds first because they can't be used for anything else. That's Vacation Bible School. Let's go back to our chart of accounts. Let's set up some liabilities. Your liabilities, again, are your accounts where you owe actual cash. So if we go down here to liabilities, let's say the first account is, what should I go with? Let's say a building loan. 2-10003. Let's say we still have $50,000 left to pay on our building. So now the building loan has its own account, a separate line, its own account number, and $50,000 on there. So you'll notice that when I switch over to assets, liabilities disappears. And when I switch over to liabilities, assets disappear. We only have one line right now, and that could require a category, but it doesn't have to. Categories are completely optional, but I highly recommend them because it helps everybody involved. Let's add another new account. Let's call this my CPH house account. And we'll add that on there. And let's say I presently, oops, I clicked outside of it again. I got to be very careful. Oops, new account. CPH house account. Let's say I already owe $110. Click submit. That's what I owe CPH right now. We'll cover that more in transactions, but I want to show you how you track what you owe. Let's go ahead and save these changes. The next type of account is an income account. Now, income should mirror everything else that's happening during this year. So if you receive a $100 gift, you should have income for a $100 gift, regardless of where it was given. even if somebody just drops off cash at your church office, you should enter that as a transaction so that your balances are up to date. So income would be things like offerings or tuition, which are broad categories. So let's add categories. The first new category is offerings. The second new category is tuition. And then we can add a third new category called other. Now you'll notice I can't set beginning balances here. That's just because there's not that much that you would start with. When you think about when you're beginning, it's probably at a fiscal year. So you could go through and update those, or if you're doing it at the beginning of the fiscal year, you don't have to worry about them too much. Now we'll do the same thing with expenses, but there's a lot of different expenses. Actually, before we go too far, let me go ahead and click submit and save. All right, so these are the different categories of income. Now let's look at very specific purposes. So under offerings, you might have one for general fund. There we go. General fund means your general operating account, which pays for your expenses like electricity or gas. You see, now I can enter an account number and our initial balance because these are actual accounts, not just categories of accounts. So if you are starting middle of the year, this is where you go and enter it. But if you're starting a fiscal year, it's going to be 0 because you're starting from scratch. So now I'll enter my account number, 3-10001, and my initial balance. We're pretty far in the year, so let's say we are already at $980,000 of income, at least offering income, which I'll move to underneath offerings and general fund. That was general fund. I moved general fund under offerings. I didn't mention this before, but you can tell the difference between a category and account by this green line on the far left-hand side. It might be small for you to see that right now, but hopefully you can. The next thing we're going to do is add a few more accounts. So we'll add a new account here that is VBS fund. Add an account number, and let's say we had $150 in that to start. Move that under general fund, and you can see how the totals add up. Now tuition, maybe you want to do this for preschool. Maybe you want to spell it correctly. And we'll say 3-2001. And it's near the end of the year, so hopefully we have quite a bit of tuition already in place. Excuse me. Actually, I'm going to drop that down a little bit because that is preschool. Let's go ahead here and add another new account and call this elementary school. All right, very good. So again, we are doing this pretty far into the year. You'll have quite a bit of income at this point. If you start off at the beginning of the year, you can set this exactly how you want it and limit how many buckets you have for income, which will make your life simpler. But that's not the case here. I'm going to go ahead, move elementary school into tuition, and then other, I'm going to create a new one for rental income. And let's say that is at $175. There we go. So I have 3 different categories of income, as you can see, and I named the second, or numbered the second number with a sequential numbering system so that can refer to our different categories of assets. But as you look at your situation, where is money coming from? That's what you have to put in your chart of accounts. So I'll go ahead and save that. All right, next up, we are going to go down to expenses. And this is probably where you'll have the most accounts. When you think about what types of expenses you have, that's where you start. Think about your categories. So for example, your first and probably foremost expense is salaries. And under that, you have multiple categories like pastors, church office staff, oops. Oh, and I'm doing this under I'm doing this under categories. I'll do subcategories here. This is why it's important to think this out, probably more than I have done today. Let's submit that. And then let's add another category, which is ministry expenses. And an appropriate account might be VBS. I can't type today. VBS expenses. And I'm putting that name in there just so I'll click on it. New account VBS expenses. And then I'll put in account number 1-4001. And there's my initial balance. So let's say we've already spent $500. And under pastor salary, oh wait, I'll get there in just a second. Let me drag and drop VBS experience under ministry expenses, add one more category called operational expenses. Submit that and add a new category called electricity. All right, and I'll add a T so it spells correctly, 1-51231. And let's say my electricity bill has been a bit high. And then I can drag this under the category. So let's go back to the salaries. We've started adding other expenses in here, but what would you put under pastor salaries? Well, it's up to you how you want to track it. You could put all of the benefits the pastor gives under one account. So salary, health benefits, vision, retirement, any of those things. You could put those all in there, or you could track those expenses separately. It's up to you how you want to do it. Think about your reports and how you want to see them. This is where you'll be setting up that default view. So I think for right now, I'm just going to go ahead and create a couple of expenses for pastor salary and benefits. And in this one, I'll do 1-7. All right, and we'll drag this here. I should have put in an account number. I typed it in the wrong spot. You can tell I'm looking at my outline and getting distracted. So let's go ahead and put pastor salary at about 6,000. Sorry, 60,000. I don't know why that didn't save my beginning balance. Well, when I save my account, it's probably going to refresh. We'll go ahead and confirm that. Yeah, now it took it back at that 0. Now we can put it. My hand is jumping all over. I'm dragging and dropping it. I do apologize. That's not the best training presentation there. All right, now I'll click that. When we save it, it'll update. That's one thing to note, that the beginning balances does require you to save it before it's shown. So there's the beginning balance we've paid so far. And then we'll add another new account and call office staff salary and benefits. And we'll say that's at 45,000 to date. And drag that under here. Whoops, wrong one. So you'll see how everything is kind of summarizing up at the top. You have salaries, pastor salaries and benefits is the actual account. In fact, everywhere where I have an account, I put an account number just to make that clear. Now I'm going to hit Save Changes, confirm all of those. And I now have accounts and categories in every single account type. Now, like I showed before, assets doesn't have categories, and that's okay. But I now have a chart of accounts. It's not complete. I'll want to add plenty of other accounts, especially under expenses. There's so many expenses that come into the church. But for simplicity's sake, I'm going to go ahead and leave this as is. Now, the next thing I want to show you is budgeting. Actually, before I do that, let me show you the accounts view. This view here is the accounts view. The omnibar now has the accounts showing in the order that I set them up on the chart of accounts and have balances under every single type of account. I don't have a chart yet. I haven't had any transactions. But as I click into assets, I can see my asset categories. As I drill deeper down, I can see everything. If I go to checking, I can go farther down into my unrestricted and VBS, but you'll notice after I go farther down, I don't get a chance to reconcile. That's because reconciling happens at the account level, not the restricted fund or unrestricted fund level. Now, we'll go back to home. What is a budget? A budget is your expected transactions, a summary of your expected transactions. A budget is what you expect to receive as a church and what you expect to spend as the church. And sometimes it can have some aspect of goals, saying we want to increase our income to this level and decrease our expenses to that level. Well, when you budget, you're setting aside numbers, and they should be based on historical information. You're not just pulling numbers out of thin air and hoping they stick. So when we go to set a budget that we can compare our actuals across the year, we go up to here to settings and down to budgets. And we can only budget our income and expense, because if we budget our cash assets, that's a really tough thing to track. You need your income and expense first, and by the time you have that, why does it even matter what bank account it is, at least from a projection standpoint? Now, if you are hoping to close an account and you're hoping to kind of whittle it down, that's a possibility. I've heard of that before, but it's not that common. So that's why you only budget income and expenses. Now you'll see here on this budget screen, it's a different type of screen. It's very wide. If I zoom out, I can get all of the months on there, but now you're not going to be able to see it very well. So I'm going to zoom in still. The gray lines are your categories. So income is technically a category. Offerings is a category. But then general fund and VBS fund are accounts. Your tuition is category. Your preschool and elementary is accounts. Now you'll notice that we don't have unrestricted and, we don't have your restricted funds here. That's because those are under assets. We only have the income and expense accounts. Those are the only things you need to budget. Now you can budget in a number of different ways. The first way, which I think is a good starting point, is to look at your total numbers and say, all right, the general fund by the end of the year, we're going to have $1.2 million. So you type that in, do it without the individual, or do it without the commas in there. When I go to save that now, you'll see that it's divided up across the months by 12. So 100,000 every month. Well, we know that's not how it actually happens because the summer months are slower. So we'll go and say it's only 50,000 during July and August. And December is 150 because of Christmas. And April is 150 because of Easter. So my total has actually stayed the same if I did my math right, but it updated as I went. So let's say May is 90,000. You'll see there's that update. So you can set it to divide it evenly across months, and you can do anything. It doesn't have to be divisible by 100,000 to work. And then you can go make adjustments that'll update your total. And then you could go back and set it again, and it'll add it to all of those. So whatever you do on the total impacts everything else, unless you are doing it on the individual details, then it'll roll up to the total. Another way you could do it, if you have the data in there, is to pick the previous year's budget or the previous year's actuals using historical information. Maybe you did a lot of thorough analysis and had a good budget last year, and you're starting the process early so you don't have any actuals. Well, that's one way to use budget. Or maybe this is you're brand new to budgeting, and your income is based on what you expect you'll get during that time frame based on last year. Well, there's previous year actual. Now I don't have that data here, so it won't do anything if I click on it, but you can click on these links by account. You can click on all these links by account, and you can do that same kind of thing all the way through income and expense. Now, one other thing I can show you is that you can export to Excel, do your work there, and bring it back into Ledger. I know a number of treasurers who will do that. So let's open up Excel. Slowly opening up on my other screen. Here we go. Now it's going to export what you last saved, and I made those changes and I didn't save anything. You won't have quite the same functionality like bringing in last year's last year's budget or last year's actuals, but you could enter them in here. It's meant to be an entry document, not a complete analysis document. And so maybe the general fund is more like 75,000 every month. Oops. And then 100,000 as we get closer to the year. But back down to 75. And 50, oops, wrong one. 55 for April. Well, that puts us much lower because apparently I was typing it in the wrong spot. That's why. Well, I'll show you what happens when you type it in the wrong spot. I'm going to go ahead and select all of these and copy them. Then when I go in here, I just want to find the cell that I started. So I had offerings and general fund. Mistakenly, I typed in under offerings, but general fund is what I wanted. If I select both of those, what it'll do, and I click here under total, when I click Control V to paste, I pasted in the wrong spot. Shoot. I wanted to go to offerings and paste. Even if I am, let's clear all this out. Even if I'm clicking and pasting in a row that is calculated, meaning it's gray, you can't actually change the numbers. I can paste there and it'll paste the appropriate rows for me. It'll ignore the totals because I typed over the formulas anyways, I was wrong, but paste the ones that I had under general fund. So we've tried to make it as easy as possible. Now, if you have a spreadsheet, it's easy to add rows. That breaks the one-to-one alignment. So just be careful with that. But if you'd rather work in Excel, you can do that. All right, we don't have a lot of questions. I'm right at 11:15 and I'm missing two things. So I'm gonna keep going. One thing I should mention, make sure you save your budgets as you go. It's down in the lower right-hand corner. Let's go to users. Let's actually go to roles and then users. So roles are your permission groups, and you can enter in a number of different varieties here. We'll add a new permission group down below, and we'll call this the financial secretary. And it says, what book do you want it to apply for? This role applies to Christ Community Church. Well, the financial secretary can manage the chart of accounts, manage recurring transactions, view all accounts. They can create deposits, but we won't have them creating any expenses. So we'll go ahead and click submit. So now we have another role. Let's do this one and say youth leader. First Christ Community Church. No, let's do VBS leader. They can't manage their chart of accounts or reoccurring transactions, but they can view some accounts. So when we click can view, well, first I have to create it. That's one little trick that I want to make sure you know. It says can view. Once you've created it, then you can assign individual accounts. So we'll go ahead and click save. At the very least, this VBS leader can now view accounts. Oops. But if I go here and view selected accounts, now that we've seen which book, I can go in here and select just the VBS accounts for that person. All right, I'll hit, actually I don't even have to hit save here. I'll close out of this. For selected accounts, I'll click submit. And now I can go and assign users. So there's users and give the users roles. So Peter Frank, which I messed up when I was saying, he's administrator. I'm going to go ahead and X out of administrator and say VBS leader and financial secretary. So I'll click submit. You'll notice I gave both rows, which means now Peter Frank at cph.org has access to everything that permission group provides. It's not the administrator role. There's some things I still couldn't do, but I can do anything those two roles can do. And that's why you would create roles rather than just giving permissions to people. That way you can quickly and easily reassign them. All right, that was a quick explanation of roles, but I'm running out of time. If you have any questions about roles and users, put them in the chat. One thing I should say is that you can have an unlimited number of users and an unlimited number of roles, but be careful how you use them. If you have too many people operating at once, you'll be stepping on each other's toes when you're entering transactions and editing things and reconciling. All right, the last thing I want to show today goes right back to the beginning when we talked about the Shepherd Staff import. We started this account using the basic chart of accounts. We started from scratch. But if you're using Shepherd Staff, you may not need to start from scratch. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to open up my invitation from before. This is the one that I almost clicked on, but would have been the wrong one. While that comes up, I'm actually going to close, I'm going to log out of my training one. We'll be back in here tomorrow. I'm now logged out. Here is my invitation again, and yes, Shepherd Staff Sync Training. I'll go ahead and set up my account. Takes me right back to this screen. Now this is a completely separate account, so I want to get back to that startup screen. Let's go ahead and zoom in. See if this goes quicker this time. Yep, very quick. All right, and in my address here, whoops. Fat fingers once again. There we go. Now I want to show you how to import your Shepherd Staff Finance database works, and then we'll get into Q&A. So remember I said that there's two paths. Well, before either path, the first thing you want to do is upload your database. So we'll go here to choose file. Oh, excuse me. Go to Windows, Shepherd Staff, and I'm using what I call our demo database. So I select that. You're looking for an MDB file. It's pretty easy to figure it out in Shepherd Staff, but if you need assistance, our support team is happy to help. You have those two options: import everything from my Shepherd Staff Finance database, include chart of accounts, finance, and transactions, or just my chart of accounts and current balances. Well, I want my transactions, but I have used dedicated accounts, so it's not going to let me, but I want to show this process anyways. You see, in Shepherd Staff, dedicated accounts were a fifth type of an account, and they didn't work exactly the same as assets. So we need to reverse that and apply them as assets. But it's hard to do that without knowing where you want each thing to go. So when we go to import it, when we bring it in here, it asks you that. Now, before we go too far, the reason it can't just automatically bring in all the transactions is that we're going from something that operated more like a liability and is now operating like an expense. So all of the individual transactions would have to have their signs flipped, and it doesn't work for everyone. So that's why we just bring in balances. And what it's doing is it says, hey, here is your asset account or your different asset accounts. Pick which one you want to add. Let me rephrase that. Use your asset account and assign dedicated accounts to become restricted funds of that asset. Meaning we had this money set aside before, it was set aside under dedicated. We're going to keep it set aside, but it's going to be set aside under restricted. Let's pick which asset that restricted fund will be. So we'll go through here, and I have a number of different ones, but I'm going to put checking on all of them. You can get this list that says use this selection for all. So when I click that, it now creates a new restricted fund. In this case, it's this one here under Central Trust Checking. So I'll go ahead and look down here under options. And you'll see here that the import everything option is struck through. I can't do that. I can only bring current balances, but that means that money's in the account. And so Terry's asking that question. I just saw it pop up. And the answer is yes. Jordan is correcting me on that. Jordan is far better at Shepherd Staff than I am. And so I just wanted to, I'll let him clarify that. He says you'll need to zero out those accounts first. I wonder, actually, I think that referred back to a different question. I apologize. That is not about what I'm talking about. I see Terry had a previous question. So I won't comment on that one right now. And I might, since it's very specific to Terry, I may not bring it up later on. But this one says import chart of accounts with current balances only. You can bring those balances in. They are applied on Central Trust Checking. So I'm going to go ahead and click submit, run that process. It's now going to import everything. It shows you what's happening as it goes. And it doesn't take too long at all if you have a medium-sized database. Now I have what I'd call a small database. So it is going to take me far less time than it'll take you if you've been using it for a while. We'll give it just another second. I'll take a drink while that's running. Well, when I tested this before, it was going a little bit quicker than it's going right now. There we go. Now I'm done. I load my ledger. So you'll notice that I now have balances everywhere. My chart of accounts, which is down here, settings, chart of accounts. Oh, I was closing my email so I would stop getting messages. Now you can see that I have my different accounts all the way down here. Central Trust Checking has what I used to call my dedicated accounts, but they're now restricted funds. So they're all right there. So they have balances. My unrestricted came out so that my total of my bank account is the total of my unrestricted and my individual restricted funds. All right, I think we're in good shape. So if you have questions about that, or anything else, you can start putting it in the chat. I'm going to show you a few more things before we start. So that covered our outline for today, but I want to talk about our other training resources. Well, first off, you already know about our training webinars. Those are available at 360ledger.com/training. There's also, and I should have put this on here, let me go ahead and just update it real quick. We'll call and say training webinars manual. There we go. Let me rephrase that. Training webinars and manual are available at 360ledger.com/training. We also have our products updates blog, which is 360ledger.com/blog. If we add new features or change functionality, I'll talk about it on that blog. And our resource center has all of those things in one place. So you can go and find the recordings, find the blog posts, all of that is in our resource center, resources.concordiatechnology.org. We also have our software support team that is readily available to help you. They manage our online help system, which is available 24/7. You can find articles about how to do different things. And I skipped over that before. Let me go back to Ledger. If you go down to the lower right-hand corner, there's a green eye. When you click on that, it lets you search for help articles and gives you some suggested help articles. You can also contact the support team from there by clicking in the lower right-hand corner and saying, send us a message. And that'll give you a form to submit as well as a phone number you may call. And those are the next two things on here. The form goes to support@cts.cph.org, our support email address. And of course, the phone number there is listed. That is our support line that's open Monday through Friday, 7:30 through 5 Central Time. Well, now let's go into question and answers, but let me give you a few ground rules. First off, you have to type them into the GoToWebinar chat, or as it's called, questions. It'll go and I'll see that. Jordan will see it as well. Remember, recording will be emailed. I say within 48 hours. It's probably going to be within 24, if not sooner. And then if you are watching the recording, you can ask the questions live. You can email our support team at that email address listed, support@cts.cph.org. So let me go ahead and pull up the questions. We don't have a lot today. Let's see. Can each of your books be a different fiscal year? Debbie's asking that, and yes, they can. So you'll notice that before, when I go in here to settings, let me log back in. I don't remember what password, it should be this one. So I'll log back into our training one, the one that we set up before with the multiple books. You'll notice that fiscal years is in the top part. That means that you have different fiscal years for each book. And so as you go between your books, you can have different fiscal years. Now these just happen to be the same because of my start dates. But then I can always adjust it from there. All right, so that's that one. Terry's question looks very specific, but let me read it and see if there's benefits for everyone. So Terry says, we have a daycare ran out of our church. Currently they are included in one book. Would it be less confusing to set up a new book for them? If so, would I be able to move the transactions since January over to the new book? It's up to you if you want to move them. If they're really separate entities, then sure, you probably should. However, you won't be able to move your transactions over. So I would caution you to wait to make that decision until a new fiscal year and start from scratch there. All right, next up, Debbie says, would your expenses match the income and expenses in Shepherd staff? Ideally, it should. If you're bringing over your chart of accounts and you don't have dedicated accounts, so you can bring over your transactions, then yes, that's what it should be. Now, if you are bringing over dedicated accounts, you can't bring your transactions. So your income and expense will not look exactly the same because you don't have all of those transactions in there. You can still generate an income and expense report. It'll just show the totals. So yeah, it should still look the same. All right, let's see what's next. Just Terry's one specific. She said, I've entered 3 new restricted accounts, but the blue restricted account is still listed on the same line. How would I get them moved onto a line that doesn't have the blue restricted account on the same line? I've tried to move them up with the other restricted accounts, but the line item continues to go back down. That probably is going to be a question just for Jordan. I can comment on that a little bit under chart of accounts. Sometimes the moving accounts around can be a little bit confusing. Oops, let me switch to the one that I created accounts for. I was in the wrong book. So you see here, you've got your line, which are categories. Then you have your counts with the boxes there next to it. That shows that it's movable. Then you have your restricted and unrestricted. I think, yeah, I think what's probably happening is that you've got restricted accounts. Those always move together because they're always tied to that bank account. You can't make one bank account a restricted fund of another banking account because that will affect your reconciling. So a restricted fund is kind of a lightweight account, meaning it functions as an account, and you'll see that in transactions, but it's not an account that is existent in the real world. You don't have a bank statement just for that restricted fund. You'll have it for the one that it rolls up under, like checking account here. So that may be what's going on. But Jordan, it sounds like you're going to call Jordan after the fact, and so he'll be able to clarify that. All right, I don't have any more questions waiting for me, and we are past our time. So I'm going to go ahead and wrap up. I want to thank you for watching. I want to thank Jordan for answering the questions and being on the line. If you have any more questions, reach out to our support team at the number listed before. But otherwise, I look forward to seeing you tomorrow at our next webinar in this series. So have a great rest of the day, and I'll see you at session 2.